Let us bless the Lord. In a moment, this online video will continue with our Lenten program. Canon George Maxwell will preside over that event, and he will have the great honor of introducing his sister as our special speaker tonight. She is the very Reverend Anne Maxwell, Dean of St. Andrew's Cathedral in Jackson, Mississippi. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you for joining us for our Lenten program. We will continue this program online, and we have a very special guest tonight, the Dean of the Cathedral in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, the Dean's name is Anne Maxwell, and that may be familiar to you. Anne used to be my sister. I am now her brother. So it goes. Anne's word tonight will be incarnation. You will remember that we have dedicated this series to looking again at Christian language, the way we learn our faith and the way we learn about God. Tonight, Anne Maxwell, the Dean of the Cathedral in Jackson, Mississippi, will talk to us about incarnation. Thank you, Anne, for being with us.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, George. It's good to hear your voice and see your face, though I was looking forward to being able to spend time with you and Mary Hunter tonight. But I'm glad we're able to do it this way. So in thinking about this process of language, which I love this idea, this topic, to understand our experience, we communicate, and the language we use communicates a lot of things depending on the context. So I went to college in Boston, and I know that the word tailgate in Worcester, Massachusetts means the back of a pickup truck. But tailgate in the South, as we know, means a huge cocktail party and a traffic nightmare. So context makes a big difference in language. Saved, in the Baptist tradition, says something about the security of your relationship with God. In the Episcopal Church, it also says saved is what you do with the pew on Easter morning for your mother-in-law so a visitor doesn't sit there. Now, clearly I'm exaggerating, but while we communicate, how we communicate in that context makes a big difference because it says something about our experience. And as George said about learning our faith, right? We have a language to explain the experience, but then that language also informs our experience and faith grows. Now, it doesn't have to be complicated language. It could be deceivingly simple. As Mary Oliver's poem, Praying, points out. She says, it doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention. Then patch a few small words together. Don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but a doorway into thanks and silence in which another voice may speak. In which another voice may speak. Just as experience leads to language, our language also changes our experience. I was watching the Actors Studio, Inside Actors Studio with Colin Firth the other day, and they were talking about his role as Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, something I've watched him do many, many times. And he loves to play with the words and the syntax and the phrasing. And he said, there is nothing more beautiful than taking concepts which would naturally be outside of your intellectual reach and owning them. Taking those concepts which might be outside and owning them. But then he also follows it up with this really funny story about Robert De Niro playing that part of Raging Bull. And he said when he was in acting school, nobody wanted to do the classics. They all wanted to be Robert De Niro in Raging Bull because they got to say lines like, you got something about my wife? You see my wife? And he said your arms started moving and your shoulders start moving around. And he said, and our bodies didn't normally do that. And so it gave them this whole new experience. And then he said this wonderful phrase, because you let language inhabit your body. You let language inhabit your body like an embodied practice, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So incarnation is my word. It is fascinating, that sense that the language would so inhabit our bodies, the word would so inhabit our bodies, that our bodies would behave differently. Now, not just the I'm all dressed up so I will behave well in church way, but in that I am learning a new way to become, because I am learning a new language that both claims my experience with God and informs how I live my life. A friend of mine from Covington is a high school teacher, and she also loves poetry. And I was fortunate enough to do a couple of her creative writing classes and workshops. And she'd give you a bit of a poem or a bit of an article, and then you'd have to quick write about them. And this one I've held on to. It's a poem by Denise Levertov called Making Peace. But peace, like a poem, it's not there ahead of itself, can't be imagined before it is made, can't be known except in the words of its making. A grammar of justice, a syntax of mutual aid, a feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm, is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. Peace, like language, that we do not feel until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak, because our language teaches us as we use it. Things like, how do you have a sense of a definition of a deep, abiding love or an unconditional love until it is revealed? The word made flesh. Now, we still don't really get what that means or how we act it out, but we keep saying it and learning more about it and collecting more experiences with it, and that informs our language and so on. So our language in the church, our faith language, is beautiful, and it reveals beauty and creativity and mystery. So in our attempt to bring other people into it or to teach it, we don't want to get too plain spoken just for the sake of hospitality, but we are inviting into an experience of God. And we want to teach a language, and we want to include or really encourage exploration and let their experiences inform our experiences. That's what continued revelation is about, and why we haven't done one prayer book and never done another one, right? Because we're always exploring how the experience informs our language and the language our experience. Now, quick little sort of sidebar, I'm not suggesting we do cat in the hat liturgy, you understand, where the narthex now needs to be called a foyer for hospitality. Maybe, but maybe you could just teach somebody what narthex means. Because I think it's good to have to struggle with some words. Words like salvation, sanctification, and narthex, and ambo, and ambri, all of those worth thinking about and exploring and learning more about and asking questions. Because it's not about imposing beliefs, right? It's about encouraging exploration. And as my dad always said, the questions are far more important. So what is the point? Well, the point to me is Jesus's words to his disciples. I have come that your joy might be in, my joy might be in you, and your joy might be complete. That my joy would be in you and your joy would be complete. And that leads to a lot more questions. Now, remember everything that you learned from Brene Brown and everybody else, that difference between happiness and joy. I'm not talking about the fleeting, externally controlled happiness. I'm talking about that really grounding, solid, internal sense of joy, because that is also our source of connection and belonging. And it's all about relationship. When I was in seminary, they say you've only got one sermon, right? So my friend Burr and I, every scripture, he'd say, well, that's about evangelism. And I'd say, no, that's about relationship. Well, clearly, if you're doing both of those right, they end up being about the same thing, I think. But that's where that sense of my witness in my context, but also in a context I'm trying to put myself in, is all about relationship. And it's all about trying to communicate that joy, that their joy might be complete. This joy that I am learning from Jesus might be shared, that it might be complete. It's a come and see kind of witness. And it's about the joy in conversation. So how do I shape my language, and particularly my language of faith, around a principle of incarnating the word such that people are drawn to the beauty and the creativity, and so to God? Not so that I tell them what to believe, but so that we learn how to live. John Philip Newell writes, the church's role is to serve that deep knowing and to help translate it into how we live together with the earth. See, it used to be that in the church we thought we had the truth. And so it was a matter of telling people what the truth is. But now we have come to a much more humble and, I would think, accurate way of serving. That we serve the deep knowing that is already in the heart of creation, to birth and nurture the interrelatedness and the sacredness that is the earth. And as Newell says, we need the courage to see what is and the compassion to act. So what is the context in which you live and in which you minister and witness? What context might you be able to put yourself in? How do we appreciate the context that someone else is in, and then draw them into an understanding of how God expresses joy and blessing in that context? I'm not talking about happiness. So it doesn't negate suffering, but it does mean searching sometimes, and sometimes really hard, searching for the joy and blessing that is there. For God's abundance and God's joy and God's presence are there, and more often than not, God uses us to reveal it, even when it's not necessarily and clearly would be harder for God. Two scripture examples that struck me as I was preparing this. One we had a few weeks ago from Exodus 17, where the people are wandering around the desert and they're complaining again, and they're fussing at Moses about, bringing them out, and they're going to die, and they've come out from Egypt, and they are thirsty, and there is no water. Now, God can produce water. I mean, God can produce rain right off the bat, right? But God, instead, there's sort of an elaborate process. Moses has to get some people together. He has to get his staff in his hand. He has to travel a distance, pick out the rock that God shows him, and strike the rock with his staff. And then suddenly the water that was already there in the crevices of the rock is revealed. And it is revealed through that relationship between God and Moses, because they are in conversation. The second one is coming up this Sunday in the raising of Lazarus. Now, it's sort of intriguing in thinking about this story, and it always amazes me in scripture that you come up with the same story over and over again, and then suddenly you hear a little piece that's different. Although I will say that Susan Garrity helped me hear this different piece this time. But when Jesus, we already know of the intense relationship between Jesus and Martha and Mary and Lazarus, and the relationship that they've built over time. So now Lazarus has died, and he has the conversation with Martha, and he has a conversation with Mary. And then he has that compelling call to Lazarus to come out. He doesn't go into the tomb. He doesn't force it. Lazarus has a choice. Lazarus is sitting in a dark tomb, suddenly breathing again, and has a choice to continue that relationship, to continue that conversation, to come back out into the light, to be with Jesus. And then there is this wonderful piece that I've always loved about the the community when Jesus then turns to them and says, you know, unbind him. And so the community has to come and touch him and unbind that which has held him. And so they are a part of this restoration, a part of this healing, because that happens a lot in John, right? There's always this sort of ongoing two-way relationship conversation where there is healing, but you got to wash your eyes. There is healing, but you need to ask this. It's not just sort of a passive touch as much as it is an engagement, because there is a choosing to abide with one another. And that is incarnating joy. I have a series of slides, which I'm hoping you went too fast. Hold on. So I did point. I'm sorry. We're working on this. So I have a series of slides that I want to show you because I want to look at the different ways that I have gotten to experience taking this language into a different context and seeing how it gets played out. The slide that you were looking at for most of the time was an icon that we used in an Advent program. And the Advent program took, we had lots of magazines and they were all the ads, you know, for Christmas presents. And so you pick out certain colors on the icon, but you take all the scraps of paper from the magazines, rip them up and put them in to the colors, and what you end up with is this beautiful icon. And it's sort of taking the commercial and creating an icon, but it's still the magazine ads. Another way that we do that is with pilgrimage. And you see the slide here with David White's statement about what that journey feels like. And then we did a couple of pilgrimages. So this one is to Honduras. And there's a small village in Honduras, and we had an ongoing relationship with them for a while. And so we went down there. The first time we went down there with all of our tourists and all of our cameras, and we started taking pictures, and they loved it. And they were really curious. And it dawned on us in looking at all of their houses that nobody had a family portrait. And one of the things that we ended up doing was taking family portraits of all of them and sending it to them. And then we did a picture directory for their village, which, as we all know, is kind of a pain in the neck to do a picture directory for a parish. So it was great to do it for the village. They were very appreciative. This next one is to Iona. I was really fortunate to go to Iona last year in October, actually when I was discerning whether I wanted to seek a call here at the cathedral. So being on the Isle of Iona was a wonderful place to do that. This one I love. This is the view from the hotel. This is still Iona and the bay. And as we were looking there, totally enthralled our very first day, and we're, you know, just everything is so brand new. And we're looking at it, and the guy comes in, that's the chef there, and he said, yeah, it's a beautiful view, isn't it? Don't get a touch to the animals though, because that's dinner. So next one. And now this next pilgrimage was in Molokai. This was a really extraordinary trip as well, because I knew nothing about, when you think of Hawaii, Molokai is not usually the first island you think of. It is one of the least inhabited, but it's also where the leper colony was in Kalapapa. And so that top corner is us having survived the hike down, and much of it is just like that looks like, with all the little steps. And it's a long, strenuous hike. And you go down into this peninsula where the leper colony was at the time. And then you have to turn around and come back up there. And then while you're doing it, huffing and puffing, you think about the fact that Father Damien made that trip at least twice a week, sometimes more, when he was serving churches both in the leper colony and topside. This is Father Damien's statue. That's his church and his gravesite. And then this is Mother Mary Ann, who was the nun who brought her, several of her nuns from a convent in, do you remember where they were from? I think it was Philadelphia. And they came out to Molokai to minister with Father Damien. She had, this is kind of pertinent to our current situation, she had extremely strict guidelines as to how they took care of patients. And the nuns would come in to like an anteroom, and they would scrub down, and they would put on what they were going to wear. They went in, they dealt with the patients. They came back out. They took all of their clothes off and they put on a fresh habit, and they went to where they were staying and where they ate their meals. They spent plenty of time with patients. They touched patients, but they scrubbed down, and they always changed their clothes, and she lost none of her nuns. Father Damien, of course, did end up contracting leprosy and died after many years there, and he was very beloved. This is the bishop's house where the nuns stayed, and these are the last two nuns that are there. They were really wonderful. They have been there for years. There are only 2 people left at Kalapapa today, and they said it had been their calling all along to be here to care for these people until the very last patient was gone. Now, times have changed. People's response to leprosy has changed, and they are welcome to leave, as are these patients, but they've grown up there, and that's where their life has been, and so they're staying, and these nuns are staying until the last one. So we go in to take the picture, and of course, this is Bill Miller, who was my rector in Covington, and he'd been wearing a baseball cap all day. So he said, wait a minute, let me take this off, take the picture. And she said, well, hold on, let me fix your hair. And it was really sweet to watch that interaction. This is, Ho'opono Valley is an amazingly gorgeous place here on Molokai. It's also Greg's family. This is Greg over on the side. Greg's family has been in that valley for generations, and he holds to a lot of the old ways, and then he flies back to Honolulu where his wife lives and is a TV reporter and lives there. But he also teaches a lot of classes, takes nature hikes. But his conversation about language and how we embody language was absolutely fascinating. He went, there's this big ritual, like you come to the front of their property, and you have the shell, the big shell, and you blow into it and you wait. And you wait until someone from their household blows the shell back to say, now you can come in. He said, you would never just drop by somebody's house. You just don't do it that way. You need to ask. And so there's that ritual. And then when you do get to that person's home, there is this hello ritual where you put your forehead against their forehead and you breathe. And once you have shared the breath with one another, then you would proceed on about your business. So one of the things he said was that was the definition of aloha. He said, now I know the tourist trade all over Hawaii, they say, oh, aloha is the word with many meanings. And it can be hello, and it can be goodbye, and it can be, he said, none of that's true. He said, aloha means love. And it is this kind of intimate love. That's all it really means, but that's what it means. Which was, it was wonderful to hear him say that. But then the other shoot of that was that, so then when we left, this pilgrimage, and Bill and I went to the Big Island, and we did some other trips, and you walk into a hotel and they'd say, aloha. And I'd think, well, hey, I don't really know you that well. So it kind of changed the word for me after that. But he does a wonderful job of explaining about the plants and the language, because the language means so much to him, and he's trying to hold on to what that is because it informs him. Now, it wasn't all heavy duty. We also had a chance to see hula dancers and beautiful sunsets and other things. And this was one of my favorite. This woman is part of the Molokai kayaking group, and they have like a team. And she took us out, and she talked a lot about the area and the water. And then she'd say, oh, wait a minute, I think, can you smell that? And you'd smell this dreadful thing. And I expected her to start talking about sewage in the water or what the shipping lanes had done. And she said, that's the hunu, which means green turtle. Turtle breath is some of the worst breath you have ever smelled. And when they all come up in a group and they go, and it's dreadful, but it was great because we had all the sea turtles that were swimming all around our boats, and it was really wonderful. And it just smelled terrible. It was hysterical. So what's the next one? So this next trip is a trip to Cuba. Now, this one language was really interesting because I don't speak Spanish. I keep trying, and the only thing I've got down is Rojo. So the bishop of Cuba doesn't speak English either. So we grinned at each other a lot, and we spent a lot of time together on this trip. And subsequently, fortunately, she had a translator. But we kept laughing because I said, if you say red, I'm going to get that. But other than that, not much. But this was all of us together looking at the plans for their camp and conference center, which somehow they have managed to keep that land all through the revolution. And so it's now available, and we were helping them build a camp and conference center. Sorry, go ahead. This was also, you know, you got to have fun on some of these trips. So this is us out to dinner. We also were able to take the bishop, that's the bishop, to a resort where she got a couple days off with her husband and a chance to sit on the beach. This is us in her church. And then also in the top corner, this is when she came to Covington. Fortunately, we have a wonderful Spanish department at the school in Covington, and they came over and did most of the translating and the conversation with us and did a whole presentation for it. It was really wonderful. But it was interesting to then be sitting there listening to her struggling with the words she knew, and we were struggling with the words we knew. And then we had these wonderful translators that could kind of smooth out the rough edges and manage to be in a continuing relationship. Okay, this one I just threw in. This is a bit more dubious of a trip. It was supposedly a pilgrimage. They went to London because the Saints were playing. But I do understand they also had an amazing tour of Westminster Abbey and Evensong. So, yeah, my husband's looking at me because I didn't tell him what was in the slides. So the other place about capturing context and language is not to miss the random holidays. I mean, there's nothing in our church tradition about Halloween, but it is so popular. Why would you not incorporate that and jump on that? Plus, they were so cute that year when Sam was just a baby. Animal blessings, which I know that a lot of us do with the St. Francis blessings. This one in particular, we started holding it in the park around the corner from the church because it was nice, big, grassy space to hold it, but also it so invites everybody that's in the park to be a part of what we're doing. And they're sort of wandering over because there was a band and there was stuff, and it was fun. And we, over time, developed people, much I would think like your farmer's market, where it's an easy place for people to come in and begin conversation and develop relationship. And then you're informed by that experience of those people being there as well. Here in Jackson, they have been doing a 9/11 service ever since. And it's turned into the first responders Eucharist, and the firemen always come and the police always come, and we always have a bagpiper for a reason I'm not 100% sure, but she was wonderful. And then that bottom corner picture is because the firemen then invited us to the pub around the corner. It was Martin's, and so of course Katie and I went and hung out with the firemen who kept saying, I didn't know priests did this. So it was really fun. We learned from each other, you could say. These are just some low-hanging fruit. Silly hat day, and besides, I had just gotten the ears from Disney World and had a chance to use them. Also, St. Cyr's Supper. It's all about playfulness and joy and abundance. This one, not so much about joyfulness. This is in response to, we've gotten a notice many years ago that the Bishops Against Gun Violence wanted us to really play up the June 2nd day. And so I went to first I gathered a handful of friends and said, we need to take a picture of us all in orange so I can use it on the poster. And then I went to 2 clothing stores in town and I said, would you help me do this? Could you do orange for your storefront that day? And this particular one in the bottom corner, she said, great, I'll give you the week. And she put me in the newsletter. They had orange as all of the clothes there. And then of course I advertised that if you need something orange, you could go there. But she and I ended up having a really interesting dialogue about what it was we were talking about with gun violence and how hard it was to have the word gun in there versus just violence, and what did it mean, and how did it make a difference for Covington, and how do we experience it. And it opened up this real context. And I ended up with a new orange shirt. So it all worked out. This was a Lenten program where we were trying to figure out the big picture on one side. We were trying to figure out other ways to deal with racism without just talking about black-white racism. And because we've been doing a lot of programs on that. And then somebody said, well, they've got that whole Pantene skin color. And so we started, that's where all those pictures are with all the different hues. And it was really fascinating to kind of open that up. And then the footprints you see in there is because we had also done Walking to Jerusalem the year before. And so this time we did Walking to various sites of oppression. And we had, you know, like going to Emmett Till's grave, and then we had going to the Japanese internment sites, and we had picked various areas, but it opened up all new language about these traditions and what they had experienced. We also invited the Tibetan monks to come, and they did a sand mandala in our parish hall. Yeah. And then, as is the custom, after a closing ceremony, of course, they swept it all up and we headed down to the park. Now, if you'll notice that bottom corner picture, they asked me to lead them to the park. And so, A, it just so happened I had a crimson color skirt. Wasn't that wonderful? But B, the whole time I'm walking down there, I'm like looking to see if they're there. And I'm also thinking it's a very silent procession. And I was also thinking, okay, I will add this to my list of things they never told me in seminary I'd be doing. But it was a very meaningful thing. And then we also ended up doing prayer flags for that, as they had taught us. And that is in front of our church. And so we left out fabric for people in the neighborhood. And lots of people came, and we talked about prayer flags and answered prayers and what does that mean. It gave us a whole new way to connect. This was our Mr. Rogers Day. We did, the graphic is from the invitation we sent for the one we did in Covington. And then when the movie was getting ready to be released, the week before it was released, we did another Mr. Rogers Day here. And Katie had the wonderful idea. She said, well, we have to change our shoes when we first come in, because he always did that. And so we processed in and sat on the steps and changed our shoes. That was a lot of fun. But it was just a playful way to do it. Okay, so this was the first fall I was here. We did a big tailgate party as our regathering in August, September, because of course, everybody was already talking about football anyway. So it seemed to me to kind of capture where people were at that particular time. And I really thought it was all going to be about Mississippi and, you know, about Ole Miss and Mississippi State. But the winner of that contest was, in fact, Texas. Now, granted, there's one guy that put a lot of money into it because he wanted to make sure that he won, and we sang his fight song as we were headed out to the tailgate. But the Mississippi State tailgate did win. This is back in Covington for the Marcus Williams Day. Now, you may remember, because it's etched into our brain, of seeing them running down the sideline and Marcus Williams missing a tackle, which then allowed the Vikings to a 29-24 lead, and we lost in the playoffs, and we were out. We were this close. We were this close. So people were already talking about it. They were already upset about it. Some people were calling for Marcus Williams to be traded. Other people, you know, and it was one of those big to-dos, as is football, right? Because that's the way they feel about it. So we did a Marcus Williams Appreciation Day that Sunday and did a whole lesson about forgiveness and about what do you do with mistakes. And you'll recognize the language since if you listen to the Brian Stevenson thing, because our tagline was, "You are not defined by your worst mistake." We also invited Marcus Williams, but he didn't come. But it was a wonderful opportunity to talk about that. So then these last couple of slides will be following the 2019, because it's sort of a culmination, because we had been working so hard to keep looking at every possibility from Annual Blessing to Marcus Williams, how we could speak to what was already going on and what did we authentically have to say. Because some of it is playfulness and joy about changing your shoes on the steps, but it's ultimately about the language of love that was in Mr. Rogers, or the language of forgiveness through Marcus Williams. It's ultimately about communicating that faith language, right? So in this case, it was like the quintessential staff meeting, because, I mean, Bill had been at the game. We were all devastated. Everybody was just the refs in this particular situation. So playoff game, sorry, back up. Playoff game for the Rams. Gosh, I've lost his name. I was saying so many mean things about him. So the Rams defensive back barrels face first into Tommy Lee Lewis on the sideline with 1 minute and 45 seconds left in the game, and there is no interference call. Now, had we had it, had we been able to get the ball there, clearly we would have won that game. It didn't happen. It was horrible. They even apologized. The NFL even apologized later, but of course that didn't change the fact that we didn't go to the Super Bowl. People were so angry at the refs, they had to sneak them out of their hotel and put them in another hotel because people were threatening them. So the emotion around our area was just off the charts. And so Bill came in staff meeting and said, we got to do something with this passion. I don't know what it is, but it's some sort of black and gold yellow flag thing. And we got to do something. And then everybody started saying, ooh, what if we did this? And what if we did that? And he said, we got to do something with these penalty flags. And I said, well, we already have a history of prayer flags. What if we figure out a way to take them from penalty flags to prayer flags? And Morgan said, and we got to figure out a way not to make the refs the bad guys, because we're the ones that said you can't be defined by your worst mistake. And so it opened up this whole, how about if we redirect this language of injustice over a bad call or a no call to passion for the real injustices that are in the world. And we shifted that language around, and it ended up becoming this huge deal. And somehow Fox and Friends found out about it and wanted to tape a live segment. So we got everybody, we said, okay, we need you to all come to the church, dressed in your stuff. We'll give you the prayer flags, but you got to be there by 7 o'clock in the morning because they're going to do a segment. And so we all came, everybody's waving and screaming and yelling and flipping our flags around and doing the chants and stuff. And then all of a sudden Bill would say, hold it. And we'd all have to stop in place. And he would answer questions because, of course, he had the headphones on and we couldn't hear them or see them. And then he'd say, okay. And then we'd all do it again. It was an odd morning, I will say that. But it took this enormous passion and redirected it for real injustice. And at the same time, it was incredibly playful. Do you have the next one? Yeah, that one you got to see if you can hear this. Okay, you can do the next one. So this was the altar cloth and the poster in the back. You'll see those same prayer flags again, the yellow prayer flags that are all outside. Interestingly enough, we got a lot of blowback from people who misunderstood what we were doing and saw the Martin Luther King Jr. quotation back there and were infuriated that we would use it for something as silly as football. And we're like, okay, you totally missed it. I mean, we had one comment that the altar cloth was idolatry, but other than that, people really liked it. So the next slide. So here are some of the prayer flags and the things that people actually talked about and where the action was and the not only to name it, because I think it's incredibly powerful to name an injustice, but we asked people to think about what their goals could be to actually do something about it, to learn more about it, to explore how they might be involved with volunteer hours, with dollars, however they might do. They came up with everything from, the children being separated on the border to issues around divorce, to various abuses, to lack of education, to poverty, to racism. What did the other one? Just to see some of these flags. And we had a whole second line out there. So the bottom corner is the guys that were our trumpet and trombone that led us in procession out into these flags. And this last picture is, I just want to show it to you because it's one of my favorite stations. So we're doing Art Stations of the Cross in this year in our nave, as we've done last year. And this is one of the offerings, which of course nobody is seeing in person because our nave is closed. But we have put them online. So all the Stations of the Cross are online for people to use. But those are some of the ways that we have tried to look at what's happening and what is that context and what language do we have for that and how does that inform our language as well, because in the end, it's about relationship. It's all about relationship. You can stop sharing on that one. So Dan, that concludes what I have, but I'm happy to answer questions or comments.
Thank you, Anne. So if we have any questions from attendees, the way that we'll do this is you should see a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen if you're attending. You can either pop that open and type out the question, or if you click the participants button, you should be able to raise your hand. We'll unmute you, and then you can ask that question. So we'll wait just a
And then
moment.
can I make George answer the questions?
Oh, absolutely. That was the intention.
Okay.
We'll wait just a moment as people maybe formulate their question.
Okay. Well, as people are formulating those questions, I'm also curious about what context they've noticed, or what other context. I think the cathedral works really, your cathedral works really hard at recognizing context in all sorts of ways, in all kinds of different contexts that you're in, and taking your responsibility of being in the city of Atlanta very seriously. So I'm also kind of curious about what context you see there.
We have a question from Sam Candler.
Myself.
There we are. You are unmuted. You should be good, Sam.
And that was wonderful. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Sam.
So I'm really interested in this whole penalty flag thing, because I didn't understand it when it was going on, though I understood parts of it. How well do you think that got communicated in terms of taking the penalty flag to wider injustice? I'm curious about that.
I think in large part, the people who were present understood it really well. And we continue to do some teaching around it. And so then it translated. I think there was a flurry after the Fox and Friends piece where that it didn't get, I mean, that was a 20-second spot. And so it didn't get communicated as well through that venue. So the people that I think only sort of saw it on television thought that we were making a big deal out of the football game, and sort of missed the connection. And I'm not sure how we could have done that better. And I do know that when we got criticized on our website, hindsight's 2020, when we got criticized on Facebook about it, we didn't respond as well as we should have on that. We had a tendency to more delete the critical posts than we did to really answer them. And so we ended up cutting off the conversation before it was done.
You can't see me, but I'm saying right on. I get it. I get it.
Yeah. George, I know you have a comment that you've been dying to make.
I do. I mean, I've had to live through all of these trips and seen all of these pictures deal with all of the envy that they engender. But I love how you take the very traditional language and then apply it to these many different contexts. And I'm wondering if there's one word that stands out as having new meaning for you because of this very intentional application of it.
I think, well, I guess two come to mind. One of them is not faith language, but the conversation and the way that Greg taught aloha completely changed my understanding of that word and deepened my respect of that word, and took it from being a lovely tourist item to a real grounding way of being. And he embodies that so well when you're around him that you understand that. On the faith side, I would say that it took incarnation from a seminary paper word to a lived ability, to a word that suddenly becomes something that you can use outside of the Christmas season, and really does inform more and more, particularly when it's tied to joy that way for me. So.
Thank you.
Okay. And I'm looking forward to the next trip. So.
This is Dan again. I don't see any other hands raised or questions being asked, so I'll turn it back to to George.
Well,
first.
then could I raise my hand and say how pleased I am to have been able to be with you. Dan, thank you for walking me through it this afternoon. And thank my husband who came and sat here off screen and hit my slides for me so I didn't have to lean over and didn't comment on his pictures that showed up in the slides without me asking him ahead of time. So thank you very much for that, dear. And thank you, George, for the invitation. And thank you all for participating in this webinar.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for showing us those wonderful trips and making us think again about some of those words that are part of our tradition. Well, to all of you, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again at our various offerings, all of which are available, and in particular on Sunday. So, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
God.